Hey guys, Frosty Knives here, back with another book review, and today we are going to be reviewing the sixth book that Stephen King published, and the first in the long-awaited Castle Rock tour that we're embarking on. We are going to be taking a look at Stephen King's The Dead Zone, and I have The Dead Zone here in hardcover and in paperback. Dead Zone was published in somewhere in the 70s. Hold on, I will get that for you. Dead Zone was published 1979. Paperback clocks in at 402 pages. And the original hardcover clocks in at 372 pages. And The Dead Zone is a very simple story. You may have been familiar with it from either the movie with Christopher Walken or having read it. The Dead Zone is a story about Johnny Smith, the man with the non-name, the nondescript name. Johnny Smith, it's basically about two people. It's about John Smith and Greg Stolson. Johnny Smith is just a regular guy. He grows up. He has a small accident as a child on playing hockey on ice, which is the first time he gets knocked in the head, and comes out and sort of has a very small psychic flash. And then it goes away. He pretty much forgets about it. Grows up, becomes a school teacher. So he's a young man in his 20s as a school teacher. He's out on his first date with a girl from also from his school. I think her name was Susan. I should probably be more prepared, but I'm pretty sure her name was Susan. If not, somebody will correct me. And they go to a fair on a date. Johnny drops her off home. He takes a taxi back to his house. There's a horrific car accident, and Johnny winds up in a coma for 5 years, 4.5 years. Winds up in a coma. When he comes out, he has psychic abilities, although he doesn't know it immediately. But when he comes out, his psychic abilities, he has them. And the thing about Johnny's psychic abilities is he can't control them. It's not something that he can control. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. When he touches a person or an object, sometimes he'll get a flash, and sometimes he won't. So it's one of those uncontrollable things. And so the book spends a lot of time talking about Johnny in his coma, talking about Johnny coming out of his coma, talking about his rehab, talking about his brain, talking about his condition. There's a large portion of the book that feels like, I don't want to say a medical textbook, but like a medical case book on a person who's been in a long-term coma and now who comes out, and how does his rehab work, and oh, by the way, he has psychic abilities, and what does that do to your brain? So there's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of medical stuff, there's a lot of textbooky stuff in this book that almost makes it feel at some point like it's a case book, a medical case book. Some people may find that fascinating, some people may find that boring. I found it to be a little bit sloggy. I found this book to be pretty dry, to drag a little bit, to not be as exciting as some of Stephen King's other works. So what do you do with your psychic ability? Well, two things happen in the book as Johnny sort of becomes, I guess, famous. One is the sheriff of Castle Rock, John Bannerman, has been investigating the Castle Rock Strangler, this person who has been raping and murdering girls in Castle Rock. And he's at his wit's end, and so he contacts, at his wit's end, he contacts Johnny Smith for help. Brings in a psychic to see if Johnny can solve the murder. And at first, Johnny is reluctant, but he eventually agrees, and he goes to Castle Rock, and he solves the murder. And I'm not going to spoil any of this. But he solves the murder, and that's the Castle Rock portion of the book. Most of this book doesn't take place in Castle Rock, but that's the Castle Rock portion of the book. That's about 40 pages. When John Smith goes to Castle Rock and does his investigation and wraps up the case, that's about 40 pages of the book. So it's a very short look into Castle Rock. And the other part of the book is the story of Greg Stilson. It's almost like these two characters, Johnny Smith and Greg Stilson, we're seeing them grow and mature at the same time. Greg Stilson is a douchebag. He's done lots of things. He was a Bible salesman, door-to-door Bible salesman. As a matter of fact, that's where we first see Greg Stilson. He's selling Bibles door-to-door. And he winds up going to this house, tries to sell his Bibles. No one's home. There's a dog there. The dog sort of barks at him. Greg Stilson gets pissed off because there's something wrong in his brain. And he kicks the dog to death. And that's the first intro we have to Greg Stilson's character. Eventually, he goes from town to town. He starts building a power base. He starts surrounding himself with shady people. He starts doing shady things. He decides to run for, like, mayor or councilman. And towards the end of the book, Greg Stilson wants to run for president. So Greg Stilson has created this corrupt power base. He's power hungry. He's narcissistic. He does bad things. He bribes people. He blackmails people. And at the end of the book, he wants to run for president. John Smith meets him at a rally, shakes his hand, has a flash, and realizes that at some point in the future, you're not sure when, Greg Stilson is going to become president, and he's going to plunge the world into a nuclear war. And now Johnny Smith has to wrestle with, what do I do with this? And that's the age-old morality question here at play. Knowing what you know about Hitler, would you go back in time and stop him as a baby? Would you go back and stop Hitler if you knew what he was going to do before he got into power to do it? And that's really the age-old question that this book tries to answer. At the end, Johnny Smith says, yes, I'm going to try to stop him. And he goes to a rally, attempts to assassinate Greg Stilson. Assassination doesn't work out, but the ensuing events that happen around the assassination make it so that Greg Stilson's true character comes out and he gets blackmailed and barred, and his run for presidency crumbles. I'm not really going to spoil the ending. His run for presidency crumbles, and so even though Johnny Smith didn't assassinate him, the job is done. You know, Greg Stilson is no longer going to become president, so Johnny Smith has saved the world. And that's pretty much how it ends. There's a little bit more to it, but I don't really want to give too many spoilers away in case you want to read it. So, overall, I think this was, in my opinion, this is not one of the. This is a slow read. It can be very draggy at times. It can read like a medical case book at times. There's a lot going on. This was written, I think, at a point where we weren't really getting stories about people coming out of comas and getting psychic abilities. It was relatively new. This doesn't really stand the test of time because there have been, since this was published, there have been other books that have tackled this subject. Even Stephen King himself has tackled this subject. Think of 11/22/63, where he again tackles the whole subject of, you know, could you go back in time and change history kind of thing. So other people have done it since then. Other people have done it better. Other people have done it worse. We've gotten movies. We've gotten many variations on a theme of this subject since then. So it doesn't really stand the test of time. If you want to read all of Stephen King's work as a completionist, I would read it. If you're looking for something new, it's not really, this isn't going to grab you or feel as something new. The back says, is truly frightening, will scare you witless. It's not going to scare you. I didn't find it to be scary at all. I found it to be interesting, but not scary. And one of the things, criticisms that I have of the book is that it does two things at once. It's Johnny Smith, and then he gets tapped by Sheriff Bannerman for Castle Rock to go and find the Castle Rock Strangler. And that whole story in and of itself was wrapped up, done, finished in about 40 to 45 pages. And then Johnny Smith goes on and does the whole Greg Stilson story where he tries to stop Greg Stilson from being president. And the Castle Rock bits almost feels like it was shoehorned in. Like Stephen King had two ideas for this story. Does he want Johnny Smith to go and solve murders with his psychic abilities? Or does he want Johnny Smith to go and stop a crazy politician from becoming president? Like he wanted two stories, but he couldn't decide which one he wanted to do, so he wrote them both. And when you write two stories like that, I think one inevitably suffers. And the one that suffers is we didn't really get the story of the Castle Rock Strangler. It was done really short, really succinct. And I think that's a detriment because I think the story was kind of fascinating. The story of the Castle Rock Strangler and the murder mystery. I mean, that could have been a really good story of Johnny Smith being, you know, a murder investigator and exploring this and really exploring Castle Rock and getting into the head of the killer and exploring the killer's motivations and his lifestyle and all the stuff. That could have been fascinating. Instead, it was wrapped up in about 40 pages, so it really didn't go in depth. It was almost like one and done. Let's use this to propel the story forward and sort of get it out of the way and show that Johnny Smith can do these things, and then move him on to Greg Stilson. And so, you know, I think either he should have committed to the murder investigation thing and maybe not have used Greg Stilson, or just committed to Greg Stilson and not have used the murder investigation thing. It almost felt, like I said, shoehorned, pigeonholed in, just to show all the different things that Johnny Smith can do with his psychic ability that he can't control. Johnny Smith is not that much of an interesting character. The story is a very fatalistic story. There's not a happy ending to this story. Johnny Smith really got the crappy end of the deal. He really got the roll of the dice. He came up snake eyes. He did not get a good shake with his life. Everything that can go wrong in his life has gone wrong, and it's just really a downhill slope of Johnny Smith getting further and further kicked around by fate and life and getting kicked in the ass and getting the shit end of the stick. So you really do, in a way, feel bad that Johnny Smith has gotten the raw end of the deal through the whole book, but he's not that interesting of a character. His girlfriend is not that interesting of a character. His parents aren't that really interesting. Johnny Smith's mother is a hyper evangelical, God-fearing woman. I mean, you've seen that before. You've seen the reluctant hero before. That's sort of Johnny Smith. You've seen the overzealous religious character. You've seen the hyper-violent politician or person that needs to be stopped. So none of these characters are new. We've seen them before. I don't want to say that they're one-dimensional. Johnny is a little bit one-dimensional. There's not a lot interesting in his character. Just the reluctant hero that doesn't want to use his powers. And Greg Stilson, the hyper-violent man who we all know needs to be stopped because he's just a hyper-violent douchebag that just needs to be stopped. So there's nothing new here. There's nothing, we've seen it before. It might have been new in 1979, but we've seen it since then. And we've seen it, I want to say, better since then, or more interesting since then. It can get a bit sloggy. It can get a bit slow. It can read a bit like a case book. It doesn't really commit to a story. It sort of goes from point to point to point to point, kind of showcasing what Johnny is doing. Doesn't really stay where I think it should stay from time to time. At the end of the day, I don't think it's one of King's strongest works, although a lot of people do like the book. I don't think it's bad by any stretch of the imagination. Like I've said previously, I don't think any of King's books are inherently bad. There's just some that are more interesting than others. Some that are, I think, superior than others. And this one isn't bad. It's just not, I guess, an interesting read, in my opinion. Which is unfortunate, because then this book is followed up by Cujo, which is the second in the Castle Rock tour that we'll be talking about later on. And in my opinion, Cujo is the ultimate slogfest. It is a very slow book, and it's hard to read because I think it is so slow. So, at the end of the day, I'm going to give this a 3 out of 5. It's by no means a terrible book. It's by no means a bad book, but it's not one of his better books. I think it's sloggy. I think it drags at some points. I don't think the characters are particularly interesting. I think they could have been better. I think King should have committed to one of the two sort of plots of the post-psychic Johnny world. Does he want to be a murder investigator? Does he want to stop Stilson and go with one or the other and just go all in with one or the other? It's not going to scare you. It's not a horror book. It's more of a psychological thriller. It's more of a psychological book, not really a horror book. Nothing in it is inherently horrifying unless you feel that the character of Greg Stilson in and of himself is horrifying, which one could make the case for that. But it's more of a thriller type story than a horror type story. Maybe in the day it was more horror, but really it's sort of a thriller book. But still, 3 out of 5. It's where we first get to see Castle Rock, even though we only get to see Castle Rock in a very short, like 40-page spree. A little bit there. It was the first time we were introduced to Castle Rock. And then we get introduced to Castle Rock fully in other books. So there we are, folks. There is my review of Stephen King's The Dead Zone. 3 out of 5. Pick it up if you'd like to read it, if you want to read all of King's books. But at the end of the day, I wouldn't classify it as a King must-read. Even though it's part of his early canon, part of his early output of material where he was really starting to churn out some really good stuff like The Stand and The Shining, Salem's Lot and all that. Even though it's part of that, it's not one of his stronger novels. So there you go, folks. I hope you enjoyed the review. Give it a thumbs up, share it, subscribe, comment below, tell your friends, tell your enemies, and as always, I'll see you in the next video.